Oh, what is, I'm so excited for the next three speakers. This is just kind of one of my dreams of getting three super knowledgeable people here together to talk about the Clean Water Act. So no PowerPoints. This is just going to be a discussion, and I have a bunch of areas that I want to get through. So I've asked each of these three to give big picture thoughts, overview. And let me do a quick introduction of them. We've got Dan Opalski, who is the director of the Office of Water and Watersheds for EPA's Pacific Northwest and Alaska region. He's out of Seattle. In this capacity, he leads EPA's Clean Water Act programs, including those focused on water quality standards, water quality assessment and impairment identification, TMDLs, point source discharge, permitting for Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And the Office of Water and Watersheds oversees the drinking water programs for all 4 states and implements drinking water requirements in Indian country. Interesting, in light of the previous couple of presentations. And then we've got Jennifer Wigal, who has been at DEQ for 15 years, and she is currently the DEQ Water Quality Administrator. Prior to that, she worked for EPA for 10 years. And DEQ's water quality program's mission is to protect and improve Oregon's water quality, protecting Oregon's rivers, lakes, streams, groundwater quality, keeps these waters safe for a multitude of beneficial uses, such as drinking water, fish habitat, recreation, and irrigation. And then we have Laura Kerr, who is a partner at Stoel Rives Environment, Land Use, and Natural Resources Practice, where she counsels clients on complex challenges arising from federal and state environmental law. Advises on environmental compliance, cleanup of contaminated properties, managing environmental risks and transactions, and is really someone who we are looking to more and more for guidance on issues like water quality. And there was just something that came across my computer screen the other day. It was a little piece on Laura, and one of the questions that was thrown at her was, what is an interesting fact about you that most people don't know? And what she said is, prior to becoming a lawyer, I spent time researching leatherback sea turtles in the Caribbean. I can rattle off a plethora of fun facts about leatherback sea turtles. So right on, girl. All right, so we're going to start with Dan and Jennifer and Laura, and hear a little bit about their work.
So before I get to big picture, I want to sort of link back to some of the prior speakers. And first, I will start by saying that so far, there's not a whole lot that I've heard that doesn't resonate for me in terms of kind of critiques of where we are currently. I do want to comment a little bit at sort of Mary Lou's humble self-presentation in terms of her work. When I in my career, I've been at EPA for a few years. 5 of those years were here as director of our small office here in downtown Portland from 99 through 2004. And Mary Lou was in the office then, as she is now still for a bit of time, and was one of the people who really kind of indoctrinated me to life and work in Oregon. And that included significantly introduction to a lot of work that she had been doing for a long time that intersected with the interests and concerns of the tribes in the state of Oregon and more broadly in the region. So she was a part of my education upon coming to the Pacific Northwest and to EPA Region 10. Now, one of the very first tribal people that I actually met and tribal professional staff at the same time was Chair George. And I still remember the day that I went out to meet her for the first time, and I kind of stumbled into the parking lot of the building where they were located, and I didn't know what she looked like. In fact, I don't even remember if this is kind of embarrassing. I don't even remember if I was aware that I was meeting with a female. That's hard to admit. But the point being, so I get out of my car and I'm kind of looking around like a fairly lost soul, I'm sure. And this person comes striding very confidently across the parking lot. I got used to seeing her stride confidently over a number of years. And we shook hands and kind of got over a little bit of awkwardness, I'm assuming, kind of on both our parts. And the rest, as they say, is history. I have had the pleasure of working at various times pretty closely with Kathleen over the years. And given the challenge that she threw down at the end of her talk so generously, I'm going to follow through in the way that I always have as a hallmark of our relationship, which is I'm not going to feed you a line. I'm not up for that challenge. But what I will do is give my best on my perspectives and share with you some of my thinking relative to today's topics. I really appreciated Representative Helm's comments. And in particular, just because he was very direct in talking about the role of money. That's a hard one for us to talk about, and it's not a popular one, especially for a career person as opposed to maybe somebody who's in the political sphere for whom it's kind of a safer territory to talk about. But one of the things that I find consistently challenging in my work under the Clean Water Act is that you find things dressed up as regulatory or relationship problems that actually, to me, end up being money problems. There are places where if the resources were there to match what we say in our policies and our priorities, I don't mean what EPA says, but we as a society say are our policies and our priorities and the things that we really aspire to, then we really need to follow through with supporting that with the resources that are necessary. I am, in the context of today and the word that the representative used, the money we have through the infrastructure law is unprecedented in my career, right? It really is unprecedented. And it means really incredible opportunities and also challenges to make sure that we make good on the expectation and the possibilities that it represents. To that point, though, now if I go back a little bit historically, one of the things that hasn't really been touched on with respect to kind of the history of the Clean Water Act is one of the big things that happened with the amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act that was what we all think of now as the Clean Water Act because of the 72 amendments, is that it actually opened up the funding stream in what was then, EPA's construction grants program to really actually answer that, okay, if we're going to expect to control and limit discharges, especially from municipal wastewater treatment plants, then we need to have a resource stream to support that. And so that was a big, meaningful difference that happened via those amendments. And I think by and large, that was a big part of the progress that was made in dealing with some of those very sort of visceral and visible challenges that other people have referred to, and frankly, I think was very successful at a basic level in kind of rising the tide, if you will, across the board for much of the country to address those challenges. As we come fast forward then, I think the reality is, we still have treatment plants out there which are, if not the same facility that was built with resources from that era, then there are the vestiges of it upon which modifications have happened and so forth. And I think we need to just kind of recognize that that's where our infrastructure is. And I think that Congress's action to provide the resources via the bipartisan infrastructure law at least partly recognize that. But as the administrator said, even in recent days, in one of his community visits, it really is just a down payment because there is so much that we have to make up from years of not enough resources to match what we were doing. So it's great. Senator Merkley has been a leader in the infrastructure side, and of course I also am thankful for his support for the work in the Columbia Basin in the building of that program. I'll kind of use that mention to acknowledge that one of the things that is interesting in the Clean Water Act space is I think that in terms of its basic fundamental architecture, it has been understood to be sort of a no-touch zone because I think people are afraid to open it up lest you don't know where you end up at the end if you kind of start all over again. That being said, we've had some creativity used by different legislators and appropriators to add and amend parts of the Clean Water Act that we see directly here in the Northwest, of course, because of Clean Water Act Section 123, which gave us the Columbia River Basin Restoration Act, and the program that we're working very hard to effectively implement. And then most recently, as language that was provided via the National Defense Authorization Act, another Clean Water Act amendment, which now has codified our Puget Sound program and has established a national program office in Seattle for our work on Puget Sound. So if you think about it in terms of other programs you've heard about, there is a Chesapeake Bay National Office, there's a Great Lakes National Office, and now we have a national office for Puget Sound. We've got some work to do to stand that up. It's a great, I think, affirmation of a lot of work that we've been doing over years in Puget Sound and measures we've been taking and organizations that we've built because they made a lot of good sense, and we, sort of blessed them or solidified them through MOUs. Well, now they're in statute, and we're required to do that work. And I think importantly, as the delegation saw it, the federal family is required by the legislation to show up together to help with the work in Puget Sound. So while we don't see wholesale changes to the basic structure, there are opportunities and meaningful opportunities that we've seen, that are very relevant to the Pacific Northwest, where we've had amendments that do target water quality protections, and in some cases different approaches, where they're more a recognition of it not being a regulatory framework, but a partnership and relationship framework by which a lot of good work can happen if we all figure out how to pull together in the same direction. So I want to do one more kind of drop back to what I see as the historical context, or maybe it's my current view of that historical context. And this again goes back to some of Kathleen's remarks. I think where we start and what the original Clean Water Act, again, as we look at the amendments of 72, what it essentially did, but it didn't use these words, but it's what inspires me when I come to work every day to work on the Clean Water Act, and very relatedly, a lot of the work in the Safe Drinking Water Act, because it's sometimes hard to pull those two apart, as the representative's remarks highlighted, the intertwining of the water resources is so important and so almost artificial to tease apart, and that happens too in the regulatory space from my perspective. But we're in a place where I think and I hope that people are comfortable to recognize or in calling out that idea of turning on your tap and not being scared of what you might find in that water. We're talking about a right. It shouldn't be about a luxury. It shouldn't be about I wonder. It should be, this is something that I can count on. Where we are as a society, where we are as a country, that ought to be a given, right? And the same way, I think in terms of other things as rights, are well, what about how safe is it for me to assume that I can dive into a body of water, as Senator Merkley referred to the Willamette? I should be able to do that. I shouldn't have to stop and ask myself, can I do that? That ought to be a given for us, right? That's what it feels like to me. And then it relates to things that are our rights. So especially in the context that we have in treaties, but other places where we reserved and made commitments, and we have trust responsibility to the indigenous people of this country. We have not just the right from the standpoint of what are we doing to maintain and restore the integrity of our waters so that there actually are fish to catch, but also so that you're not wondering too much about, is it safe for me to eat that fish once I catch it, right? Those are rights that we should demand and aspire to and commit ourselves to moving forward to attain every day. Whether we get there, that's the challenge for all of us, and unfortunately, I don't have all the solutions, but I think it starts with, we have to have that aspiration, we have to have that commitment, and then we move forward from there. So, a couple of things that I will share is I do agree, as I've said, with sort of the critique, if you will, that the Clean Water Act was designed for certain things at the time that it was, that the principal amendments happened, and it, I think, has done a decent job at that. There are still excursions away from that. It's unfinished business. I think that one of the things that I suspect that Jennifer will have a few things to say about this is that a lot of the Clean Water Act responsibility has been sort of passed along by design to the states. Sometimes with some mixed messages about expectations, some mixed messages again in terms of what is the funding support that can be provided. And I'm cognizant of that every day as I'm working with my state partners and trying to figure out how can we, work through some of those realities, but also do what we can to maybe influence things so that it's not quite feeling like that much of a here, you can take this dripping bag kind of situation, right? So we need to always be partners and stay at the table and be part of that conversation, even where the states are the lead. I do also think that one of the things that is true, and there was some reference to this in a general way, I think that we are dealing with situations where sometimes the sort of the vintage Clean Water Act didn't fully, in the framers, they had what they had right in front of them, and they were designing the system to address that. And again, I think by and large, in the basics, it's doing its job and it's still there, and we can count on it to continue to, do some adaptive kind of changing, and we can work within that system. But I think there are elements of that were not understood where the science has moved forward, and so that the scope and the nature of the problems that are really relevant and important for water quality just are different than what the framers could possibly have understood. Now, I think the language was written flexibly enough, and in partnership with tribes, with local governments, with others, I think we've worked pretty well within that relatively static framework to apply it to some of the newer circumstances. But the reality is, it is extremely hard to keep up with the advances in science, which it's kind of that double-edged sword, right? You want to know those things. You need to know those things. We need to advance in our understanding and stay invested in quality science that informs us. But it's going to give us, what we have seen is it has broadened the definition of sort of what the problem is, right? And so that is a challenge to keep up with, because then our kind of solutions don't always keep pace with the problem identification. The second thing is that I think that, so that's kind of, I guess what I'll be a little bit more clear. I'm talking about cases where some of those problems were probably already there. The science we just didn't have the science far enough to understand them. But we've got another dilemma, which is, as people, we're pretty good at making messes. And we're not so good at following, everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten, clean up your messes. We're not so good about that part, even still. And so the Clean Water Act has a hard time keeping up with those new messes. I was thinking about this quite a bit, and again, here's kind of the overlap with the Safe Drinking Water Act, more so in the Safe Drinking Water Act territory, but it also is used in Clean Water Act. We talk about emerging contaminants. When I think of the examples, whether it's PFAS and all the significant energy and focus and resources being poured into addressing the huge family of PFAS compounds. We call it an emerging contaminant, but they've been around for a long time. And they were into the marketplace because of the wonders of chemistry that we all benefit from in our daily lives. But they got out there, and then by the time they were in water bodies, we were way behind the curve, because the things we could have done to maybe have prevent them and so forth, those were no longer options, right? They were already there in the things they were designed for, and then in all the places where you didn't expect to see them, they ended up as well. The thing that's unfortunate about that, and again, back to Representative Helm's comment about things being unprecedented, frankly, we have a lot of unfinished business on PCBs, right? Which were at one point the emerging contaminant that has it. They're not quite maybe the level of complexity, or maybe we've gotten a little bit laissez-faire about them because they've been around for a long time. But PCBs in a lot of watersheds, if you look at fish tissue, are still driving the risk profile for fish consumption, right? And that's a concern, and we haven't kind of finished with that, and yet we're moving on to the next thing. And so they're not emerging, and what it points to for me is that the Clean Water Act alone isn't going to stem that tide of those things coming at us. There have to be other policy decisions and, again, resources and programs There's been some really good work on updates to the requirements under TSCA, right? And to try to take a different look at how do we accelerate the review of chemicals and so forth. But the reality is we get things in the marketplace that we don't understand until sometimes much later what their impacts can be. And by then, again, as I say, that sort of, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've lost that opportunity already. And we need to figure out how to kind of, I think, right size that or right sequence that a little bit better in a broader way. And that's going to take a long-term commitment and some fundamentally different thinking, I think, to get us there. Because the Clean Water Act can't affect that, right? Once the chemical is there and it's already been released for a decade or something, and maybe it's in the sediments, especially these kind of forever type chemicals, the reality is it's got limited tools right now, unless we say, well, there's the authority always to write sediment standards and let's regulate sediments and how we, right? That's a possibility, but that's a huge kind of different thinking for folks to undertake. It's something that's, state of Washington certainly has gotten into that work. But I think even there, we haven't figured out what that means kind of relative to do you do a sediment TMDL? I'm not sure what anybody knows exactly what that would look like, right? So, and I will tell you then, as another kind of poster child for us right now is for us in the Northwest and for our focus in our Puget Sound program has been, but it's a broader issue, certainly for us where we're thinking, especially about coho salmon, is 6-PPD. And so for people who aren't aware, people are generally aware of what I'm saying when I'm saying 6-PPD. So tire dust compound that, it's interesting if you know a little bit of the story, I'll go really quick through it. The Stormwater Center in Washington actually figured out that stormwater was the problem that was basically lethal to the fish, right? And they actually also figured out a really good answer for the interim, which is you filter the stormwater through a nice soil column, and it does a really good job of knocking down that concern, right? So that's great. So we have something to implement. But in the meantime, we've got this legacy, and we've got this chemical that is part of the chemistry behind tires that is something we're going to have to deal with. Well, the researchers went to work to kind of tease through the haystack of all the chemistry that was in the tires, and they didn't get much help from material data safety sheets, right? They didn't get the chemical list. So it took basically a decade to figure out what the specific chemical was that was creating the problem, right? And that's a shame because with a little bit more cooperation and conversation, we could have gotten about that work a lot faster. But it took that long just to know what the chemical was. And now we're catching up in terms of let's figure out analytical methods. Let's figure out, what's the regulatory regime around that. So I guess that's my kind of poster child for another case where we've got to figure out how to be on the prevention side, how to think about how we stop things from being in the water bodies first and foremost, or we figure out better ways to minimize that, and then we can let the Clean Water Act go to work from that point. I also do, since I'm going on a little bit long here, I do want to just make one comment on the non-point source space. So the thing that strikes me when we get into non-point sources, and I think many of you probably recognize this, but is just how broad that terminology really is. When we're thinking, often people finish that phrase with non-point source discharge, right? We're not kind of just talking about discharges, we're talking about all the things we do that affect, that chemical, biological, and physical integrity of the waters. So by how we manage or try to manage or engineer watersheds and water bodies, we have a pretty fundamental impact on the ability of the natural system itself to provide its ecosystem function, right? To do that filtering of contaminants out in a natural way. And to meander around so there is recharging water resources, has an opportunity to do that instead of it all rushing out to the ocean, right? And we have, again, big policy choices to make about whether we're ready to look differently at some of those kind of challenges that really are a much bigger picture than just the clean water, because we don't have a way to get to those things. They're all about those kind of things that have been traditionally non-touch zones for EPA, land use planning, a lot of choices, right? And it's not, this isn't, by the way, my intent by saying it is it's not sort of to demonize any particular land use. It's about, let's all be thoughtful about it and be real intentional and think about how we can support the water that we want to support us as we go about all that very important work. So I want to say one other thing is that as we go at our work on the infrastructure side with the amazing resources that we have the opportunity to work with the state of Oregon and others on, is one of the things we can do is maybe support some of those natural systems by looking at how we are doing things like, supporting the drinking water providers partnership that is so effective here in the state, looking at how, drinking water and Clean Water Act sort of objectives can really align very well and are in place, but other places where we can look at, well, maybe traditional technologies are, I'll say great technologies are not really necessarily the place. Let's see where we can think about adding more green infrastructure. But in all of that, I think we also, certainly from the president on down, the focus is that what we want to do with the resources that we have really to use right now is to look at disadvantaged communities, give people who haven't to date necessarily even had the ability to dream about what that future could look like when they could have clean and safe water, and give them that opportunity.
All right, excuse me. Thank you, Dan, for setting us up. And maybe it's becoming a bit of a theme, but I also just wanted to spend a moment and reflect on Mary Lou and Kathleen's opening remarks. And like Dan, when I first started working in Oregon, the first two people I worked with was Mary Lou and Kathleen. There might be a trend going on here, but I appreciate Holly's introductions of kind of a brief bit about where I've come from in my history. But I actually want to just spend maybe a minute more and talk about that, because I think where I've come from and the experiences I've had have kind of informed a lot about how I think about the work that I do and that we do at DEQ. With age, I come to appreciate even more and take less for granted the opportunities that I had growing up in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in a small town in Northwest Washington State that was at the foothills of the Cascades. It was largely a timber economy, but bordered on some of the richest agricultural land in that part of the state. It was also a stronghold for salmon, and growing up was also one of the few places in the state where people could go and reliably see bald eagles. So that was the environment in which I grew up. It was also, and that was something I was aware of, I was 30 minutes to the sound, 30 minutes to the mountains. But also, one thing that I now have a bit of emotion about, and a little bit of anger, I think, even, it was also near the Skagit tribe. And it was also, because of the agricultural economy, had a very significant Latinx community as well. And that part of our community and that part of our history is either something that wasn't taught, which I think is true, or it might have been my own obliviousness, being, the things that we pay attention to in school and the things we don't pay attention to. But I do not recall that part of our community, that part of the place in which I lived, was ever really talked about much. And so in the past 15 years I've been here in Oregon, and I returned back to my initial interactions with Mary Lou and Kathleen, that was first front and center, and a lot of that from the very beginning brought into all of the conversations that we've had. It is very much an ethic of the state of Oregon that we have government-to-government relations with tribes. We have a long ways to go in terms of how we approach environmental justice. That is becoming more and more front center in terms of how we weave that into not just how we do that work, but that is how we embed it in the work that we do, that it is part of the work that we do, and we have a long ways to go on that. And I feel like, looking back on my early childhood in the late 70s and into the 80s, that was missing. And so I do, like I said, I have a little bit of emotion around that. I feel a little angry that wasn't more, and I feel like it was a really huge missed opportunity. But when I think about the work that we do, the other thing that it teaches me is, one, to be humble. There's a lot we can learn. I learn something new every day. I learn something new scientifically and technically. I learn something new about other people and places. I learn something new about perspectives that other people bring to these really challenging issues. And I think, for me, starting this conversation from a place of humbleness, I've worked in water quality for almost 25 years, but I still feel like, at least a few times a day, I feel like I am one of the, and depending on the conversation, only 50% on any particular topic, and there's a lot to be learned here. And so when I think about the Clean Water Act, it's a piece of a much, much bigger and complex puzzle, and I have the opportunity and grateful for the chair that I get to sit in DEQ's part in doing that work. But as I go through some of my remarks, it is one seat and a very big table for the work that we all do. The other thing that I want to reflect on just a bit is, so I started my career at the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C., where I worked in water quality. I spent 10 years there, and so that was at the early part of my career. And one of the things I take away from that, and one of the early things was, in that job and working in the headquarters office, you had a shallow view of many, many, many different ways in which the Clean Water Act was being looked at and implemented across states, which was hugely educational for me to understand, what Vermont does and what California does and what Florida does and what Arizona does, who doesn't have much water at all, versus what the Pacific Northwest does, and so you've got one statute and, probably, well, if you count it, throw in the territories and everything, over 50 different permutations for what that looks like in different places and locations. And I think when we think about the Clean Water Act and what the designers were thinking about in 1972 when they did those major amendments, I think that was right to think about, for most of the Clean Water Act to have the states, be the primary implementers and designers of precisely what that looks like within each state. And so coming here to Oregon, and thinking about that, at EPA, mostly you get your Clean Water Act authorities and you're like, okay, cool. But honestly, if we really think about it, the things that really, when we talk about what were those visions, that Chair George was talking about at the beginning, there was a lot of things that the Clean Water Act lined out. Honestly, my perspective being the Clean Water Act on its own can't accomplish those things. It's really not possible. If we were only, and I think one of the things in which the Clean Water Act was perhaps a bit myopic was, really focused on, water that we can see, surface water. But we really, all of us, and I think probably most people here, we know water isn't just the water we see. There's a connection to all of the water. The groundwater, the hyporheic flow, the precipitation, even the snow melt that then, percolates into subsurface and who knows how long later comes back out as base flow and streams, many years later. This hydrologic cycle and everything, it's all connected. So to pretend that we're only talking about water that we can see on the surface and that's all we need to focus on, we're never going to get there in terms of what we would want to see in terms of water quality at the end of the day. So a couple of things I wanted to kind of talk about first was, just so now that I sit here at the state level, and this is echoing some things that some folks have already said. In 1972, we were talking about basic treatment of domestic sewage and waste streams, and that really, honestly, is not our biggest issue anymore. We know how to do that pretty well. That's going to get better. Adaptive management, new technologies, new knobs, new things that we're working on. But that's pretty. No pun intended, but kind of dialed in terms of what that looks like. But for those same facilities, the things that continue to be challenges, and the Clean Water Act and the dollars are huge here, but how do we keep facilities up to date? How do we find certified operators to run those? People who are willing to live in those communities with their rural and small towns and pay a living wage. How do we have resilient facilities? So again, today's disasters in California with the flooding, well, tomorrow is wildfire or a hurricane or whatever, right? These facilities need to be resilient. How do we keep up with new technology and get ahead of those chemicals that we're learning about, or kind of understanding better what their impacts are, and not so that we're just trying to figure out new ways to capture the needle in the haystack at the end of the pipe, which I think everybody agrees is not the most efficient way to go about it. How do we think about facilities as recovery, ways in which we're actually energy recovery facilities or nutrient recovery facilities. That's kind of the next generation of things, not just whether or not we can treat. I think we know how to engineer our way out of a box in most cases, but how do we think about what is that next generation that brings in climate, that brings in workforce, that considers economies of small and rural and disadvantaged communities. And again, another thing that's probably not, we have this idea that ratepayers, it's going to be whatever a community can afford. And the whole paradigm around, ratepayers is just, we'll figure that each community pays for their own. I think back to a point that Dan made that I really agree with is, treated wastewater and clean drinking water should be rights. And so there's a lot there, and it's not all on DEQ to figure it out, but it is part of this larger puzzle. And so we have gone from something that was maybe a little bit more basic and straightforward to, again, something that the remaining issues are definitely more complex and don't just sit within the Clean Water Act. The other thing that, as we're thinking about, water and what are we doing within the state and how does the Clean Water Act function? Again, if we're just thinking about what's, kind of bank to bank and above the stream bed, well, ultimately that's, we're only going to be able to go so far with what we think about in solving those issues and what is the quality within that. And what we really do know is that, we're not just talking about water quality, but in order to have water quality, there's a relationship between that and the aquatic ecosystems and what our fish need. We also understand that how we think about this, the stream ecology, as well as this, the stream geomorphology and how we've treated floodplains and what we've done historically to the channels of the streams themselves. Well, we know that creates water quality issues because it scours up sediments, but we also know those systems are less resilient to climate. We know that creates flashier water systems. We know that then that makes water less available in times when we actually need it. And so, ultimately when we're thinking about water quality, that's one point of entry to larger challenges that we have around water quality itself. And also the other piece I'm just going to note here, because, when we think about that and we think about kind of all that relationship around water and ultimately what it means for water quality, this whole notion of what is a water of the U.S. that we've been arguing about for the better part of 3 decades, I'm not even going to talk about that here because, anyway, I'm just not going to talk about it. But back to kind of states' roles, I think this is, for Oregon, and I'm not going to speak for other states because a lot of them don't want to argue about all of that. But, here at least, I think in Oregon, what we've been able to do is design a program that's both built on federal authorities and state authorities so that we can be more encompassing in our view of water and water quality and water quality protection. Thinking about what is a water of the state and not just where does the water of the U.S., leave off and is that line changing again? But really trying to think about more holistically, how do we go there? The other thing that I think that has been particularly, sitting in a state chair is, I was thinking last night, I was thinking, okay, well, what's that quote about states are the laboratories for, it was the laboratories for clean water, no, it's the laboratories for democracy, but I think that states are also been the laboratories for water quality and Clean Water Act and innovation. And that's why I was jumping in. I was really tired last night, but that's why I was jumping into my head. And, there are things that we've been able to do as states, and we've been able to learn from one another and adapt different strategies and approaches to really solve what we see, both in terms of priorities. So here, so many things have been driven by cold water needs and salmon and fish and climate. so what do we see here in the Pacific Northwest that we need to be addressing? What do we see as our community values? What do we see as ways in which we can work within our state laws? Again, Oregon has some unique things around land use and some other things that, how do we set our own priorities? And so, here in Oregon, we've been thinking about how we, one thing that Oregon does very well is marrying up our Clean Water Act protections with sources of drinking water and thinking about how do we bring that together so that we can be effective in protecting public water supplies, both groundwater and surface water. We've done things with our industrial stormwater permit to marry that up with our clean water, with our cleanup authorities in the Portland Harbor area. We think about how we work with Department of Agriculture, Department of Forestry, Watershed Council, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and how we think about controlling diffuse runoff of pollutants. We've definitely got a big hydropower presence here in Oregon. So how do we think about, how do we approach 401 certifications for hydropower for privately held dams? Water quality trading, we've done a lot of great work around water quality trading and ensuring that we're not just talking about gray infrastructure, that we figure out ways in our permitting process to also incorporate green infrastructure and green solutions, both through water quality trading and also as part of, potentially as part of the treatment train itself at facilities where that makes sense. So those are all things where we've thought about, like, how do we take our Clean Water Act and how do we build on it in ways in which, it can make sense and get to some of those bigger objectives that we have here in Oregon. The other thing is that then, probably 2/3 of the work that we have at DEQ is Clean Water Act, in origin. And I would say the other third at least is state law. So everything from our statewide on-site septic system program to permits that we issue for facilities that do not discharge directly into streams. So the non-discharging permits are waters that have, or facilities that have reuse. So we have a complementary permitting program that's solely under state law. We have groundwater authorities. We have other authorities that we use to evaluate new water rights permits that think about what is the water quality impact around a new withdrawal of water. Things on climate, we are doing things that are looking at ocean acidification and working with our climate protection program and thinking about how do our strategies marry up with some of the state's larger climate efforts. And those things all happen not because of the Clean Water Act, but because we have additional and in many cases complementary authorities that fill in some of those gaps. And thanks, Dan. And think about those things. Two things I'll say before I pass it on to Laura. So two things. One is that there's a really important role for states, but there's also a crucial role for local governments and communities as well. And like I said, it's a very big table that kind of there needs to be lots of seats at in order to really get to where we see things going. A lot of the things that we implement rely on local implementation, such as stormwater programs. So anybody has a stormwater permit from us, it requires them to develop kind of a stormwater implementation program that works for them. We have a lot of community partners that augment the work that we do. Watershed councils do a lot of monitoring, and we pull in that data and use it for a myriad of purposes, among other organizations that do that kind of work. We also are working, like I said at the outset, working really hard to think about how do we incorporate community understanding, so whether it's disadvantaged communities, other different even down to the neighborhood level, like what are the disproportionate impacts that people are feeling? How do we consider those things? How do we prioritize work and dollars that we administer to really try to ensure that those needs are known and that can be incorporated into the process? And we've got more work to do there, but I think there's a really important role there in terms of a seat at the table. And lastly, I think I would be remiss if I just don't reflect a little bit on our relationship with EPA, and that relationship is really important too. EPA does a great job of both kind of from a regulatory perspective, kind of leveling things among the states and creating kind of minimum expectations, minimum requirements. but they also are a wealth of scientific and technical expertise. And so in some areas, Oregon's, we've been able to, we do have some amazing expertise in certain areas. Other areas we don't, and they can both help facilitate that expertise or provide it directly. And I think 6-PPD quinone and some of these other things where, Washington's been doing a ton of work. EPA, both our neighbors to the north, and working with EPA on trying to figure out how do we reap benefits from things that we don't have the capacity to do ourselves. And of course, we also often here in Oregon find ourselves in the same courtrooms, sharing those experiences with EPA as well, when we do have legal challenges to the work that we do. And I think the one thing that plug I would put in and is that, the other thing that we really do look to EPA and their relationships with the other federal agencies that also have a role in this is, one, thinking about how do we go upstream and control some of these pollutants. It's not, for things like whether it's PFAS, 6-PPD quinone, whatever the next topic is that comes in our door for things that we need to develop strategies around. We can do the best we can here, but also once we understand something's an issue, how can EPA and how can we lean on EPA a little bit to say, TSCA, CERCLA, FIFRA, the alphabet soup of federal environmental statutes, to really help really work on things at both ends, right? How do we prevent further contamination? How do we get movement on cleanup sites or Superfund designations if those are needed, in addition to the work that we need to do when things have already been released into the environment? So with that, those are all things that kind of where we sit, and in large part, I would say just end by saying back to Representative Helms' remarks, focusing a lot on kind of the bigger water picture. When I look at what are our biggest challenges, what are our priorities, what are the things where we need to do better and think about more, it really is those things where it's the nexus between state and federal law. It's the nexus between things that come, that need, not just my agency's authorities, but other state agencies' authorities, local governments' authorities. Those are really the most complex and challenging issues. And really, in order to solve kind of that next generation of challenges, it's really about bringing kind of all the people, the authorities, putting the people, filling out the seats around the table and understanding how do we leverage all these different pieces and elements that we each can bring to really truly kind of problem solve and get to solutions that make sense and get the kind of the biggest bang for our buck as we're thinking about how we can move to these many outcomes that we all would like to see and that were originally envisioned so succinctly in the original Clean Water Act. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Can we clap for you too?
No, don't do that to me. You gotta hold me honest too. You gotta have time. I have so many questions for both of you. So, well, thanks to both of you. I think you're about to hear me pull on many threads that we just heard from both the speakers, because I think there are some real themes emerging here. First of all, I want to say I think that most people that work in the water quality space come in with a deeply personal story about water and why they ended up working here. I bet most people in the room have that story. You heard Jennifer's. Mine is that I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, right near the Inner Harbor, which is the kind of center of the city where most industry is. And I have a distinct memory, alluding to being angry, of falling into the harbor when I was a kid and having my mom pull me out and running me home to take a shower, because you couldn't not shower after falling in the harbor because of the levels of pollution and some of the bacteria that were growing as Baltimore became warmer. And I think it goes to Dan's point that, it makes me angry to think that I grew up in a country where, despite all the development, that could still be true. And I can say, as I made my way out west over time and landed in Oregon, my first job here was with the Multnomah Education Service District's outdoor school program, which some of you may know or may have gone through. And I landed my first job teaching water science to all the Portland Public School, or really Multnomah County school students. And I remember just being astounded that this program existed out here. The state or the county is paying for every student to go to this program, and then I get to teach them about water science in 6th grade. It blew my mind, coming from the East Coast, and I think really, to me, reflected the ethos of this state and this region that you've heard from both Dana and Jennifer, and was, for me, a real privilege to move to a place that put such focus on these issues. And I've ended up here and staying here in large part because of that. And so again, deeply personal connections to water quality that get us here and have us thinking about and reflecting on the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. I practice environmental law, so I am deeply ingrained in many of these statutes in the alphabet soup you heard about today, with the Clean Water Act being one of the primary statutes that I'm thinking about day in and day out. What does that mean when you're a private practice lawyer? I think the unique perspective I bring here is that I spend my time working with a wide variety of entities helping them comply with the Clean Water Act. So that's anywhere from manufacturers across the region who are doing food manufacturing, metals, recyclers, waste management companies. So a large swath of manufacturing waste companies, as well as working with a lot of hydropower facilities, like you heard Jennifer talking about. 401 certification under the Clean Water Act is a huge deal out here, so we're working with a lot of those folks to navigate those issues. And then also a significant amount of that work in the private sector is working with municipalities and cities who are trying to figure out both how to comply with permitting programs that they're under the Clean Water Act, as well as how to administer their own programs. We're hearing a lot about the importance of local jurisdictions and the role they play within the Clean Water Act. And then a lot of work working specifically with wastewater utilities, drinking water utilities, who are dealing again with being regulated as those entities, as those utilities, as well as regulating. And so trying to figure out how to do that, how to comply with the laws, and how to do so with limited resources. I think what Tan said at the beginning is the fundamental issue when we think about this act and implementation and success under the Clean Water Act is, if we had all the money in the world, we could fix these problems, but we don't. So how do we work with limited resources and aging infrastructure? I think I want to start, given it is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, and we're saying happy birthday to those amendments, I think I want to focus on drawing some of the themes you've heard and focus specifically first on successes, because we cannot ignore that this is probably, with maybe a nod to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act is probably the most successful environmental law that this nation has ever enacted. And that's a really powerful statement. I think it's true. I think you would both agree with me, though we can have Q&A and see if we fight about that. But the 1972 amendments proved transformational. And we have significantly better water quality than we did prior to the enactment of those amendments in 1972. The nation's rivers, streams, jurisdictional water bodies are significantly cleaner and have been transformed. And that is really powerful. And I'll come back to my reflections on that. But how did we get there? What did the Clean Water Act, what did those words on the page do to get this transformation? From my perspective, I really think there's two primary successes of this act. The first that you've heard about over and over is the permitting program, right? We have this act, that Section 101 of the Clean Water Act says that we're trying to restore and maintain the biological, physical, and chemical integrity of the nation's water. It also says that you cannot discharge a pollutant. There can be no addition of a pollutant from a point source into a water of the United States. That should have an asterisk. It's a little bit of a confusing statement because you think, well, there's lots of discharges. It does. The asterisk to that statement is the entire National Pollution Elimination System permitting program, NPDES program. National Pollution Discharge Elimination System program. When you work in alphabet soup, you always move too fast through the acronyms. So the NPDES program is the the fundamental permitting program that the Clean Water Act, it's the backbone of the Clean Water Act, where the Clean Water Act said we're gonna, through permitting, point source discharges, create technological standards that allow us to improve water quality by permitting certain sources, using technology-based standards, effluent limit guidelines that drive those technology-based standards, by implementing those programs and giving facilities this permitting scheme that they have to enact. I will tell you, as someone who represents a lot of entities that have these permits, especially when it comes to NPDES permits that regulate their direct discharges to waters, at this point, I would almost call those rote for many of our clients. Certainly, we'll get into some of the issues that are coming up that make us think about that. But for them, those are really fairly straightforward permits. They're technology-based. They know how to put their fingers on those levers and make things work. Those are things there's a lot of regulatory certainty for them there. That has been a huge improvement, and at this point, we've really successfully enacted that program, certainly with some challenges and consistent reflection, but it really has been a pinnacle of our program. Second is, and you've heard a lot about this, so I won't harp on it, but there was a massive infusion of federal funding to state and local governments for upgrades to sewage treatment plants. At this point, again, feels somewhat rote to us. We know how to deal with this. We've really managed those sources and understand how to deal with those sources. But those may be rote programs, but they're so fundamental to how we got to where we are today, which is we should be patting ourselves on the back. This has been a very successful law. So I think those two I would reflect on being two of the most important and successful components of the Clean Water Act, but there's a few undercurrents of the Act that I think also have led us to where we are today with a law that needs to be improved but has had so many successes. And the first is the first undercurrent, I'm going to call it, of the Act, where I think we've just seen just such success, and you've heard this already, is the cooperative federalism model. So what's cooperative federalism? It's the idea that we're going to have this federal law enacted by Congress, implemented by EPA, but we're going to allow states to be the laboratories. States act as laboratories. It's literally something that many congressional members said as they were thinking about this model. So states can take over and implement portions of the Clean Water Act, and we've seen that happen as early as 1972. California raised its hand and said, we'd like to take over the NPDES permitting program, and by and large, most states have done so. In fact, I think one of the most recent updates we've seen there is Idaho, which took over its program in 2020?
Yeah, that's when they finished.
That's when they finished.
Yeah.
So we've really seen this cooperative federalism model work, which is, and you've just heard Jennifer articulate it more beautifully than I ever could. DEQ, Oregon DEQ, has an idea of how it wants to implement this law, but it needs technical resources from EPA. It isn't going to be able to tackle every single issue that comes in front of it due to limited resources. So it's going to confer with EPA about 6 ppd when new emerging contaminant issues come up, or it's going to sometimes rely on EPA to come inspect facilities, many of our clients, where maybe there's a gap in the amount of inspections the agency can do. EPA can come in. EPA can overfile an enforcement. So there's all these ways that EPA, in addition to technical support, can provide support in terms of implementation of these programs.
Timer.
Yeah, with his timer, perfect cooperative federalism here. And enforcement on my side.
Just to be clear, I didn't consent to that. The last piece, enforcement. The Clean Water Act is one of the first environmental laws in our country that contemplated this idea of private citizens acting as the private attorneys general. Again, states have limited resources, EPA has limited resources. This law contemplated the idea that citizens could step in and enforce. And that creates a backstop in many ways that has been fairly successful.
There are more, though there are citizen suit provisions in many of our environmental laws, there are by and large, I want to say twice as many, in my anecdotal experience, I want to say 3 to 4 times as many Clean Water Act citizen suits brought than under any other statute. And that has it's a mechanism by which folks that hold these permits or should hold these permits are held accountable, and really does create more eyes on compliance with these laws. I think anecdotally, one story I have about that model is that in 2015, I accompanied the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative program to China. In 2015, China implemented did a major update to its Environmental Protection Act. What it did, in conjunction with many other changes it was making to its laws, based on a lot of citizen distrust and frustration with the state of the environment in that country, one thing they did was implement a citizen suit model. Again, laws on paper are only worth so much. It's how they're actually implemented and whether they can actually be implemented. But China was starting to think about, well, we have this citizen suit provision, how would it work and what could we do? And we went over with some nonprofits and talked about how it works for our clients, how it works for these nonprofits, what is the value of this citizen suit enforcement? And I will never forget the questions we got that were fundamentally just amazement that this was a part of our law and that it was an enforcement function that worked, and that citizen groups did things like file public records requests. They could see data as we are now migrating to internet systems where they could just view data about our water quality. And so I think it's something we shouldn't take for granted. That enforcement mechanism is really important and can be a very good backstop. So I think those, you're hearing the same themes from all of us. I think those are, when I reflect on the Act, some of the most significant successes. But it's not perfect, and there's a lot of room to grow. And so I think reflecting on where has the Clean Water Act proved substantially less effective. Maybe first and foremost, I would say, and you heard this from Dan, non-point source pollution. We have an act that contemplates that MPDES program and point source pollution as being the driver of successfully improving water quality. Where we've ended up today is that on the backs of those permit holders, those point sources, we are seeing permits ratchet down significantly. And some of that is to make up for the inability to control non-point source pollution. So there's some inequity there, and it also, it's a really difficult problem, but it's probably one of the most significant ones we need to figure out how to deal with. The Clean Water Act itself, as you've heard from everyone else, can't be the only tool, particularly when we're talking about non-point source pollution, because, grounding this in legal thinking, which I have to do as a lawyer, the Clean Water Act is regulating water. You hear about this in a theme in most of the Supreme Court cases that talk about the jurisdiction of the act. There's a real discomfort with the idea that you're regulating land and taking away local authority, land use authority. So that creates a real tension in how do you regulate non-point source pollutions? What is the best mechanism, and how do we do that? So I think that's an area where the act, has proved less effective. You've heard a bit about infrastructure issues. I think Dan could probably rattle off these numbers, but I had to pull them from the last time I looked. I think the last time EPA provided an estimate, it was that $271 billion is needed to upgrade the country's wastewater infrastructure. Of that total, $52.4 billion was needed for biological processes to meet minimum levels of treatment required by law. $51.2 billion needed to rehabilitate and repair conveyance systems. $48 billion required to prevent periodic discharges of mixed stormwater and untreated wastewater during wet weather conditions, something we see here quite a bit. Those are staggering numbers. I think the bipartisan infrastructure law presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity to address that. I'm so excited to watch that happen, but it's still a really significant gap. I was at a panel not too long ago where an EPA official said, we're about to go on a drunken spending spree and I can't wait to see what happens, which is probably a little flip, but regardless, I mean, you're hearing from EPA, this is huge. This is a huge amount of money. States are still trying to figure out how they can take that money and spend it, but I really hope that we see focused spending so that we don't have to read about another Flint, Michigan in the news, because again, it's drinking water should be a right, and we need to use this money to improve our infrastructure. In addition to those, what I would say, not to say failures of the act, but failures of the act, I think there's also, and Dan talked about this, issues that the act did not contemplate, that Congress did not contemplate when it wrote the Clean Water Act, that we're now seeing are really critically important to address in order to improve water quality. First and foremost, and I think we can talk about this a bit more later, but the most consequential in my view is climate change. We have an act that in many parts of the fundamental programs, whether it's developing total maximum daily loads, whether it's thinking about what our standards are, the act contemplates and builds into the way it operates this baseline assumption that we can get water quality back to what it was. And how do you do that when the temperature is rising, when the amount of water is dwindling? These are fundamentally challenging issues that our Clean Water Act doesn't address. And as we try to use the tools of the Clean Water Act that are premised on these baseline assumptions that are no longer baseline assumptions that we can meet, how do we use those regulatory programs efficiently, correctly? It's going to be a real challenge. And I think Dan alluded to the fact that there is flexibility in these laws. Where is that flexibility? Is it enough to address climate change? I bring up that question because I think one thing we haven't talked about, but is the big elephant in the room, is that we have a Congress that's I'm not going to say never, but as of today, the idea that this act will change, that Congress will spend any sort of meaningful time on trying to update this law, it's laughable. And that's a really hard place to be. So we are left sitting with an act that didn't contemplate some of the biggest challenges that we're going to face today. So what do we do with that? Do we find the flexibility and try to implement programs? How do you address these challenges given the kind of static nature of the law itself? Emerging pollutants. I love Dan's comment that they're not emerging. I think that's something that always bothers me when we talk about emerging pollutants. They've been around for a while, but we're consistently dealing with this as there becomes additional awareness about how certain chemicals that we've introduced through different manufacturing processes are impacting the environment. How are we going to address those? Our clients are hyper-focused right now on PFAS, microplastics. I would say those two. I think pharmaceuticals in our wastewater stream is another that's coming up a lot. So thinking about how we can use the act to address these issues as they come up so they don't become CERCLA issues. And when I say that, what I mean is we've really failed if we can't regulate these under our pollution control laws and then are faced with the reality that we're using our cleanup law that addresses past pollution to deal with them. And last, not to delve into the fatigue about the Waters of the United States rule, but the fact is that the jurisdiction of this act remains unsettled. One of the fundamental questions you have to ask in any situation when you're thinking, well, does the Clean Water Act apply, is, are we talking about a water of the United States? This is particularly important, most fundamentally important when it comes to what's called the 404 program. That's the wetland removal fill permitting program. So when you're thinking about, can you develop a certain piece of property? Can you remove fill from a certain piece of property? You need to be thinking about, is there a Clean Water Act 404 permit needed for that activity? Do you have to go through that process? to consistently be unable to answer that question, I can tell you from a private sector side, it's that regulatory uncertainty that is just maddening. So, and then having an act where you're having whiplash from during each different presidential election cycle, where WOTUS is defined this way during one presidential cycle. Then it's this. That gets challenged. The amount of money that we're spending to litigate what's become an incredibly politicized issue, and the amount of focus on that question, I think for all of us who are thinking big picture, how do we just create a system that works and improves water quality and gives folks the regulatory certainty they need? It's maddening. It's just so frustrating that the amount of resources going into that, and that it's become such a hot button politicized issue, which leads to a lot of us feeling lots of fatigue about it. I can say in certain states where we work, that is a consistent issue you're thinking about, because for example, in Idaho, there is a law that says in Idaho that no environmental law can be more stringent than the federal standard. So in a state like Idaho, and particularly more in the Southwest where the lack of water is constantly raising these questions, you're having to think about that, and it's frustrating. In many states, we're just so far beyond that. Like you heard from Jennifer in Oregon, Oregon has basically created a Waters of the State program that is viewed as a backstop, so that as this WOTUS definition goes back and forth, it doesn't impact the water quality program in their work here. So you're seeing that play out differently in different states. In this area of the country, you can basically ignore the question, but it's an important one nonetheless that needs to be resolved as we think about the next 50 years with this Water Quality Act. I think we may see some resolution if anyone's a Supreme Court watcher. We have one of the most significant Supreme Court cases on that rule that was litigated, or argued back in the fall, and we'll see a decision on that case. It's the Sackett case, or Sackett 2 as we call it. So stay tuned for that, because I think we anticipate there'll be a lot of certainty that comes out of that case. I think I'll leave it there because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But thanks to both of you for your thoughts, and really welcome questions and discussion on these issues.
Okay, so in the remaining 15 or so minutes before lunch, we're going to dive into a couple of areas, and in full disclosure, I did let them know that there were some areas that we were going to explore a little bit deeper. But Laura, while the attention is on you, what happens when certain states, blue states, enact much more stringent regulations than other states? Does that impact where your clients want to locate? And what are some of the other implications?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, fundamentally, as we all know, water does not respect state boundaries. So it is interesting to watch this patchwork of water quality regulations and to watch the impacts of the differing laws. I think the short answer is certainly the environmental regulations can impact siting decisions. I would say it's not how stringent the laws are that's the really number one concern. What is a concern, and I probably sound like a broken record, is the regulatory certainty and the speed at which you can get permits. So we constantly have clients who are growing, who need to expand their footprint, build new facilities, and one of their primary questions is, how long is it going to take to get a permit? What's it going to look like so we can plan our treatment systems, et cetera? And those questions are really important and do impact siting decisions. And as someone who practices law in Oregon and is deeply caring about this state, it can be frustrating when we see that the answers to those questions for some of our clients lead them to leave this region because we do have a fairly significant permitting backlog. It can be more difficult to get from, we have this plan on paper to facility built with the permits in hand, ready to go. It can take a lot longer. Part of that is that there's more process because there are more protective laws, but part of it's also just resources. So it does matter, and it's something I know that lots of people are working to think about solutions to that, because it's important to keep our economy strong and to keep some of our largest economic contributors here in Oregon.
Right, and so as the state being, the laboratories, I mean, Jennifer, are you totally aware that, with the thousands or more bills that have been introduced to the legislature, the West Coast, Oregon and Washington in particular, can enact very strict programs, but are you aware that that may impact where people want to set up shop?
I think to build on Laura's remarks, one of the things that we do here is, it's kind of the certainty piece of it for sure. And I think, the other piece of it that I think is the other side of the coin is, to what degree is the state willing to consider things that are maybe a little bit more innovative, right? So, those come in lots of different ways, and what is the state's capacity and ability to think about those things? So whether it's, a port facility thinking about taking wastewater from multiple facilities for some economies of scale and efficiencies, to, natural treatment systems, to water quality trading, right? So there may be some things in which we have some more stringent requirements, but there may also be some other pathways that we're willing to try to work with permittees around to think about how do we get greater benefit from some of the things that they've got in mind. So it is, I think, I know there's a lot of things, and Laura's gonna be way smarter than I am about some of this, about all the different things that get factored into a facility's decision to site, to leave, to expand. It's really complicated, and that's one factor, and perhaps there are instances where that becomes a more important factor than others. But I also think one of the things that Oregon does have going for it is kind of this idea about how do we think about being practical and common sense and big picture water quality outcomes, in addition to the knobs and wheels and just engineering ourselves out of a box.
Dan, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, one of the things I just want to acknowledge is, and I guess this goes a little bit back to Kathleen's comment at one point about, are we to the point where maybe it's too late for some of the salmon? I think we have to grapple with a little bit as a values question, whether in the Northwest here, do we actually all agree that we still have things that are worth fighting for, and do we have other values that we want to have represented in the actions we take? I have a lot of pride actually in the work that we've done over a number of years. Again, something that both Mary Lou and Kathleen, I guess there's no coincidence there, have been involved in, is the establishment of more protective human health criteria as part of the standards that are fundamental to a lot of the kind of follow-on implementation of the act, that are reflective again of the tradition of fish-dependent indigenous cultures in the region, who we committed as a federal government have the right to continue those practices, right? And so we need things that reflect that in a meaningful way. We need to keep working on implementation, but it's an important part of the standards. And then the other part being with the Endangered Species Act, we have also aquatic life criteria in the region that tend to be more stringent once we get through consultation with the services. As a result, that is a consequence of having something still to fight for, right? And that does create some of those things, but again, I don't mean to take this too big picture, but we have to decide where our values are.
Well, while you have the microphone, Laura introduced the idea of climate change, and we really can't have any environmental conference without talking about climate change. So, Dan, talk to us a little bit about, the climate change and its impact on the effectiveness of the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what's already been said in terms of, we already have the challenges that we have, and if I think it from the standpoint of a species that maybe I do have to think about the threat from a toxic compound, now I've got a layer on top of that it's fundamental, the strata that it relies upon to exist in is also being challenged, right? In terms of both its quality, its quantity, its consistency, its the dependability or reliability, and the big fluctuations and so forth that affect not just that water, but then as Jennifer was mentioning, scouring that can happen because we've got things that are too channelized and those kind of things. So I think it goes back to my comment about, I think as we're thinking going forward, including in our infrastructure space, what can we do to actually be thinking really intentionally about how we support the natural systems more consistently and with some more holistic thinking so that natural systems can support us. And I think what you get in there often are, some of those end up being climate adaptation actions, but some are some good climate mitigations and some things. And I think it also means that as we're thinking about how we deal with some of the water problems, again, I'm back to, if you're having to use especially energy intensive treatment things at the end of the pipe, right? And energy itself is going to be a problem as we're expending the energy. Let's think about how, again, it should be giving us incentives to be looking upstream and thinking about solutions at their origin, not at the downstream end. And so I think we try to focus on that and try to support those kind of solutions that get us out of that energy intensive mode, as well as in conjunction with supporting those natural systems. I think that's probably the best things that we can do for trying to make things more climate resilient and in a way not become part of the additional sort of carbon tax that we're putting on ourselves by the way we do some of the work.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just think there's a lot more work to be done, and I know Gene's speaking this afternoon, and he can probably take questions about how we're building it into how we think about watersheds, and I think there's both, and there's a lot of work to be done around how do we both incentivize and support restoration and other types of actions that get multiple benefits, not just, are we reducing that pollutant in the in-stream, but are we, is there also opportunity to restore habitat, restore floodplain, restore, channel connectivity and sinuosity, and the other things that we know create a more resilient watershed, a more resilient stream system is more resilient to flooding. Are there ways in which we can incentivize that? Because if we just go, thermal load, you need a tree, that's just at the end of the day, that's, it might check a box, but, are there ways in which, through our water quality trading program, through how we prioritize certain types of restoration in our TMDLs in the implementation, through how we fund the different types of solutions at treatment facilities that get to not just the 1 + 1 = 2, but can we do things that get us greater benefits, more resilient outcomes? I think that's the challenge, and it requires a lot of people thinking about those things. And we're not going to pretend that we have all those answers. There's a lot of smart people thinking about this, and this is kind of back to the setting the big table for people to be, and everybody needs to be thinking about those things.
Okay, so Elise Granick, who is a professor at Portland State, will be talking to us this afternoon about toxics. You had a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paul. It was really informative. My question relates to something that the second I had from Laura speaking, but any of you can possibly answer this. But Laura, you mentioned that some of your clients, that they're seeing permits ratcheted down to make up for, in part, for non-point sources, and that they see this inequitable and unfair. But we are seeing a growing population within Oregon and globally, and as you mentioned, we're seeing less water, warmer water. What is the solution to having cleaner water besides ratcheting down permits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if any of us had the answer and all the money, we would like to fix that problem. I think certainly permits need to be ratcheted down, right? That's part of what the Clean Water Act contemplates, is that we improve our ability to implement, improve our technology, improve our ability to treat wastewater, and as a result, we can ratchet down standards. In addition, there is basically an anti-degradation policy written into the Clean Water Act that contemplates that you have this baseline and you can't backslide. That said, again, one of the imperfect things about the Clean Water Act and our environmental laws generally, but a necessary part of them, is that we've created these laws that are somewhat siloed and don't interact to create solutions always. And then we have to act within these imperfect laws. So where we have an NPDES program that works really well, where we can ratchet down those standards and get success there, certainly we should. I think my point was where we know that non-point source pollution is one of the most significant water quality issues we're facing. We certainly want to be addressing that too, to ensure that we're making the strides we should, rather than just focusing on this program where we know we can make additional changes, but it's not going to fix the problem. So I think that's my specific point. And so I do look to both of you to talk a little bit about non-point source pollution, your views on, I mean, if I'm right, you know, is that one of the most significant issues, and how do we face it?
Let me even refine the question a little bit more, at least a great question. What creative approaches have you seen? What are we trying? What could work?
Well, you know, in terms of creative approaches, I'm going to start with Laura's question, which is, you know, part of the challenges is that we do have a permitting system that says, oh, well, what is the current receiving water quality? And then you back out the permit limits, right? And so if you've not fully realized all the implementation from a TMDL and other those things, which we know is going to take time, especially in the case of temperature or other things that take a while to grow on the landscape and fully realize the benefits, you know, there is a lag in time between when you're evaluating kind of the conditions under which you're writing a 5-year NPDES permit, and then the length of time in which we anticipate other actions on the landscape and watershed should be occurring to realize those benefits. So there is that disconnect. I mean, you know, things, especially for temperature, and we, you know, may see more of this in the nutrient realm in the future, but, you know, water quality trading can be helpful in that realm, right? So if you're like, you know, especially for temperature, where those are tight limits and tight requirements, but if we can help expedite, you know, beyond kind of what's in the queue and in the pipeline for restoration activities, but if we can expedite some of those other types of landscape restoration conditions that help with the overall temperature, then I think we see that as a little bit of a win-win between the permittee being able to comply with those stringent requirements and accelerating restoration within the watershed, so that we begin to address some of those remaining non-point source issues.
So a couple of thoughts. One is I think that, you know, we have some tools within the Clean Water Act, but they're at the margins, but there's some things we could use a little bit differently. There's a little bit of a question of, I guess I'd call it kind of political will in the cooperative federalism realm about where we could be pushing a little bit harder on some of those pieces. There are certain, you know, grants that we provide to the states that are subject to us giving certain approvals, and how closely we scrutinize those and how explicit we are in kind of using a certain kind of checklist or what our metric for that is one thing. But again, I think that's a little bit more at the margins. You know, I think when I first came to Oregon at that time, a popular phrase was that we needed kind of organic legislation. It's almost that you need to have something that's focused on this as its own, and maybe it's not the Clean Water Act, maybe it's something different that looks at this problem differently, because I think we have for years and years been talking about this and not really had that sort of next solution. And I'm not suggesting that it all needs to be regulatory, but again, back to, I think one of the comments that Kathleen made, you know, there's a point where you got to call the question, how much have you let other approaches play for a while, and how effective has that laboratory been in producing ideas that actually are producing different results, and when do we need to call the question that may mean a different kind of regulatory regime? I'm not here to tell you, yes, we're here today for that, but I think we need to have that honest conversation, because there have been certain, you know, there's collaborative space that we can work in. Again, it goes back a little bit to funding. How can we get better about, for instance, having, you know, whatever dollars EPA has, work better with like farm bill monies when they come, with sort of more consistent expectations and requirements from those different funding streams, so we don't, even among us at the federal level, like saying, well, how come you won't do what we want to do with your money, you know, that kind of thing. So we need, that would be helpful in getting more direction. But I think it starts again from, there has to be a policy level decision, including, I think, at the legislative level, federally maybe, but certainly at the states currently, the way that kind of the grand bargain has struck in the split, that this is something you're going to take on. Because I think that there's a lot that people are trying to do that's in that creative space that is available. I'm not confident that it's enough, because like you were saying before, if it was, we would have solved this already, right? So we may need some more help with that.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up this this panel, just an amazing discussion. But we need to talk a little bit more about environmental justice. We've talked about that in terms of, the disproportionate impact that contaminants have had on marginalized communities. We've talked about Warm Springs drinking water. We all know about Flint. In what ways, how are you taking environmental justice into account? I know that the EPA administrator came into his position saying it was his top priority. So how is EPA considering the disproportionate impact on certain communities? And is that going to directly affect permitting or regulated entities?
So I guess that's me first, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just say that I'm excited to make sure that people know, if you don't, that in the fall, we actually reached an agreement with the Indian Health Service using infrastructure law monies to fund a new treatment plant for the Warm Springs tribe. It is fully funded. So that's one way, and that was a huge priority for me, for my staff, for my boss. So we're excited about that. Long overdue, and by the way, that doesn't mean they get a plant tomorrow, so we can't all walk away from that. We have to continue to watch that system together, and I think the partnership with Oregon and that has actually been quite good. I agree with the comment, we all could kind of do things better, as we always can, but I think that the way that people have pulled together to try to support the tribe has been pretty neat to watch. I would say that, in our infrastructure law, we're going to continue to do that in our kind of more, I'll say, sort of direct implementation space. We get a tribal set aside, so we're focused a lot on tribal communities. The Indian Health Service got a lot of resources to focus and basically to meet every need that is identified on their priority list. So we're working hard. So for instance, up in Alaska, we have a strategy over the next 4 years for addressing every unserved community in the state of Alaska. We have the resources to do that, and we just got to figure out the plans to do that, as an example. So I'll say again, kind of in the kind of the character of this region, I don't want to say it's only about this, but there are so many places where, for me, environmental justice, climate justice, and tribal justice are like, they're all part of a sandwich, right? And we're going to go after them together in the space that are priorities for my office. And I think, we're going to rely pretty heavily on the states and try to continue having an interactive conversation with the states in our infrastructure space around how the provision, especially in the infrastructure law, around 49% principal forgiveness gives us a way to get into some of those communities that was mentioned earlier who haven't had the ability even to envision what that healthier future could look like, and how do we help them with technical assistance and capacity building in order so that they can actually help be part of that, as opposed to it being done at them or for them, but it's done with them. And how do we keep those things up? So that's a big focus, is what does technical assistance and look like for us, both what we're doing federally and how do we support the state's efforts to do that, as Oregon is gearing up its own technical assistance. We have to be careful we don't overwhelm communities with multiple choice technical assistance for starters, right? Because that already is, I think, is something that I see on the horizon. And then I think that the question about how does it affect permits, I mean, one of the things actually in a conversation we're having yesterday with Jennifer and her team is, how do we think about, given the opportunity with the infrastructure law, how do we actually try to make sure that we're looking at the permit implications and thinking about it kind of both directions? Like, how can you use this money to maybe look down the stream, down the road to future things where you might not do the minimum upgrade because you want to be more resilient for kind of technologies and approaches that can help you maybe solve that next problem that you don't even know about yet. And the other part is, if you're working on a permit, let's make sure that we identify those needs and think about how those resources can help it not be so much of a compliance issue, because we're going to figure out how to help you pay for it, right? So those are a couple ideas.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. And a couple of things, just acknowledging at the enterprise level, we do have a new governor. I know this is a priority for her. There are some changes that are occurring at the state level based on legislation that was passed in the last session. And so there's, continues to be hiring and standing up of different positions to support both environmental justice council, and also to develop data and information tools that are Oregon specific to be able to help us screen and kind of understand better what some of the environmental justice communities are. So helping us understand and help us identify where we need to be zooming in a little bit more when we have a permit, when we have an action. So that's going to be helpful kind of at the enterprise level. I think at the program perspective, there's a number of different ways, and again, this is work that we need to do more and better of. But some of the examples that Dan raised, clearly with the additional dollars coming in through the bipartisan infrastructure law dollars, for us that comes into our state revolving fund loan program. A lot of those loans are to public entities, but they can fund a wide range of projects, everything from traditional gray infrastructure to irrigation projects to non-point source related projects. But we've been really taking a concerted look at both our rules and how we bring in people who are knowledgeable about various communities to inform and influence that process so that we are identifying what those needs are, so we are able to reach communities. And I think, and then also there are some new provisions in that law around technical assistance. Because the problem with some of these monies, it's still a loan, right? And so a loan is a loan. And so the principal forgiveness is a bit of a game changer. A lot of these dollars are still going to be going out as loans. And so that's just something really important to think about. And working and really, again, having that information from the community level so that they are getting something built that is something that they can operate and maintain over time. So just throwing money at something isn't always going to solve the problem. And I think the biggest thing is some of these things are going to take time. And that's, I know, going to be frustrating for some folks as well, because there's all this money. Yesterday, these needs were yesterday. But it takes time to plan, engineer, meet the federal requirements, which are not trivial around these dollars, and build, construct, operate, maintain. It takes time. And I think if we really want something that's responsive to the community's needs, some of these communities, they've just kind of been like, loans, we can't afford loans. And so to bring them in and understand and be able to successfully navigate the process and have a successful project out of it is going to take time. And so that's just one example of things that we're trying to be both get on top of, but also be thoughtful about how we approach them, so that we're not having collective regrets after all of this is done.
So we're going to have a bit of a discussion about the infrastructure funding. So Laura, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think just one parting thought, and it's going up to a 10,000 foot level, in thinking, in reflecting on this talk and thinking about the Clean Water Act, I was struck in just revisiting what was its purpose. It was to restore and maintain the nation's waters, right? That was its stated purpose. And there is a fundamental piece of what we're all talking about missing from that fundamental purpose, which is to protect human health and the environmental justice underlay of that, of all humans' health should be protected, right? And I think I'm really hopeful, this work is long overdue, but I'm really hopeful to see the work that EPA, starting at the administrator, is doing around environmental justice and the thinking they're putting into it, and we're seeing it at the state level up and down the West Coast. It's really important work, and even though that original intention was not written into the act, I think it's being infused into the act, and we all need to hold each other accountable to ensure that happens. And I appreciate that we are doing this work at this point, and look forward to continuing to think about how to do it and how to do it well.
So let's have some kind of wrap-up comments from maybe especially Dan and Jennifer. How effective is the Clean Water Act? How is it holding up? What are some of your
In 10
thoughts
seconds.
on it? Go.
Yeah. So I'll say maybe three things. One is I do think, kind of be a little bit repetitive, I think at the basic level, consistent with what Jennifer also said, it's still got a good framework. We've got capable tools. We'll keep using those. We have opportunity to refine those. I think we do have some opportunity to continue to stretch to a degree to have them cover some of the more challenging issues. I think that, but I do think that, as we were talking about, I think the non-point source nut is one to crack. in some way, either somehow within the act or outside it. And then the third thing, I think there was a similar, a common theme was, but the act needs help from other authorities and other laws and rules, federal and at the state and sometimes even local level, if we really want to make good on our aspiration and our commitment.
I will agree with Dan's sentiment. I think the thing is we get as really where we are is way more complex than where we were 50 years ago. And so we need to recognize that complexity. I think collectively at the local government and community level, state level, federal level, we all need to kind of lean into that and try to be as pragmatic as we can and not try to force some of our square pegs into round holes, and think about how do we work with what we have and how can we lean in and not let perfection be the enemy of the good on some of these things, and how do we, we may not fully know how to address chemical mixtures as opposed to a one by one pollutant, but how do we make progress in that arena, and how do we think about it, and so that we're not getting in the way of ourselves and addressing some of the most pressing and urgent issues that we continue to have to deal with. And I think at the end of the day, it's really about people and partnerships that's going to be able to get us where, to the next generation.
So Laura, you started out your presentation saying that we're much better off than we were 50 years ago. Do you have some closing thoughts?
I think closing thoughts, 50 years ago, we implemented a set of laws that allowed us to rely on a command and control structure to make some really important strides in water quality improvements. And what you're hearing now is that there's other tools that are emerging. It's not this command and control structure anymore that's going to drive water quality improvements. We need to be thinking more holistically, more creatively, needing to be patching together these different programs to figure out solutions to the problems we face now.
Thank you all. This was really, really good.